Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tukitaki's third webinar in this three-part series. Today's topic, Federated Learning, Bringing Together Industry's AML Intelligence. I am Abhishek, founder and CEO of Tukitaki. I will be your host and moderator for today's virtual roundtable. In our last two webinars, we discussed about the current COVID crisis and what has encouraged us to rethink how to approach AML and how to consider new technologies like AI and machine learning. We also discussed real life experiences to navigate challenges in deploying AI AML systems in production. Today's webinar is on a very special topic where we discuss about technologies to help us freely collaborate and share AML intelligence without giving out any personal identifiable information. I am super thrilled to discuss with an expert panel the mechanisms to promote such collective intelligence and ensure privacy to develop the next generation AML risk management program. Let me introduce you to our panel today. We have Roy Dissa, who is the Executive Vice President, Chief BSA Officer, and Chief Operational Risk Officer at Huntington Bank. Roy has more than 35 years of experiences in financial services with significant know-how on BSA AML and OFAC compliance. Next, we have Catherine Riemann, who is an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. She has spent more than 2 decades as a chief compliance officer, most recently at Citibank and previously at American Express. She is a regular speaker at the American Bankers Association. We then have Jonathan Rush, who is a practicing attorney at District of Columbia and principal at DTG Risk and Compliance in Washington. John has more than 25 years of experience in corporate compliance and served as a deputy chief of strategy and policy, fraud section criminal division in the US Department of Justice. He was also the senior vice president and head of anti-bribery and corruption at Wells Fargo. Finally, we have Robert Cushing, who has over 20 years of extensive experience in developing and implementing AML compliance program at large and global financial institutions. Robert previously worked with Morgan Stanley's financial crime compliance, with HSBC Bank, as well as he was the SVP and US head of financial crime compliance. Let me now dive directly into our roundtable. Today, we will be discussing on two themes. Number one, the current transaction monitoring landscape and how AML pattern sharing can significantly improve the end-to-end alerts management process. But before we do that, I just wanted to clarify the definition of AML patterns. In this context, the AML pattern refers to a technique involving aggregated activity and behavior to represent a suspicious activity. The second topic that we're going to talk about is developing a transaction monitoring utility service to share such money laundering patterns across financial institutions in a seamless, privacy-preserved manner. Please note that the webinars are enhanced by participation. We really encourage our audience to send questions, and we will pick them up as we go along the Q&A sessions. We also urge our audiences to take part in the polls displayed on the screens on the course of the roundtable. So without any delay, I would like to start with Roy. As an industry practitioner, we would like to know, what do you think about the current transaction monitoring landscape and the challenges faced by the industry today? Roy, over to you.
Abhishek, thank you. Thank you for the question. Glad to be part of the panel discussion this morning over here with some distinguished panelists that are joining me as well. I think to the question, Abhishek, clearly transaction monitoring systems are quite old in terms of technology, in terms of how they are deployed. Very much rules-based, very much scenario-based, looking for very specific things. In that, you have a ton of challenges. You have challenges with obviously making changes dynamically. You have challenges if you make those changes, you have to get through a whole model validation process, which is quite cumbersome. So it does not allow you to be dynamic in that sense, right? It also from those rule-based type of scenarios and typologies that you deploy, you have tremendous amount of false positives that get generated, and false positives clearly impact the efficiency and effectiveness of the program. So I would say those are the big challenges that most banks face, I suspect today, if you've deployed transaction monitoring systems in the tools we have, right? Clearly, what is needed, right, is more dynamic sort of tools and technologies here, the ability to deploy machine learning, the ability to deploy artificial intelligence type of technologies that allows you to really get down to reduction of false positives and really focusing on alerts and investigations that really matter to law enforcement.
Thank you, Roy. I'll hand it over to Robert, right? Would you like to share your thoughts on the topic?
Sure. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, and I'd like to thank Abhishek and the Tukitaki team for inviting us, and pleasure to work with such distinguished panelists. Just to dovetail on what Roy was saying, I think one of the challenges that we see also is transaction monitoring often can become a rote task. If we're talking about a rule-based system, we're generating appropriate alerts that we have to work every day. And it does become a bit mechanical. I hesitate to use the S word, to suppress. We don't want to suppress alerts, even though we know what the outcome is going to be. The suppression is something which is not viewed as positive in the eyes of our regulator, even when we are working towards tuning our systems to create more meaningful alerts that could create meaningful investigations and potential SAR filings. So when we see that we have this robotic activity that goes on with our transaction, we are not satisfied with that. But at the same time, our challenge is, if we're working towards a number, what will the regulators view that as? Are we looking to suppress so that we can cut down on the number of alerts, so that we can cut down on the number of analysts that perform the work to save the organization money? So there's a lot of gray areas, a fine line to walk in terms of trying to work smart and also making sure the regulators recognize we're trying to be more efficient in our work.
Got it. And this is where I think I would like to kind of stress on, right, as you really mentioned, right, that there are challenges in being static rule system. There are challenges in being suppressing those alerts, even though they might not be really effective, right? Now, one of the things that we had actually seen in our last two webinars is how COVID has accelerated new methodologies, new payment methods, specifically in the areas of digital wallets, P2P payments, right? And on this topic, right, I would love to go back to Roy, and as a practitioner, would love to know, right, how are the current systems coping with this sort of new ways of handling payment mechanisms, right? Are the current systems comprehensive enough to monitor such transactions effectively?
So Abhishek, to that question, you're absolutely right. COVID has presented a set of challenges in the payment space with new sort of payment methods that have clearly evolved and accelerated. No question that there are any number of those in particular, right? You have Zelle, you have Venmo, you have real-time payments now, and probably many more out there. P2P type of transactions in these spaces are difficult to monitor if you've set thresholds at typically higher levels, right? Many of these transactions are what I would refer to as microtransactions, right? They're smaller dollar amounts, especially in the P2P space. Clearly in the business space, they're much bigger in terms of dollar size. What we've had to do clearly in the space, and I suspect others have done the same thing, is go and build those type of scenarios that look for certain patterns of activity, that look for certain typologies, that look for behaviors that do not quite fit the customer profile or do not quite fit the products that the customer is engaged in or using. So I go back to scenarios always in the context of your risk assessment, right? What risks you as a financial institution have within your environment as it relates to products, services, transactions, geography, customers, and that should inform how you design those systems, right? As you point out, emerging risks in this space, require us continuously to look at those things and to figure out how we modify or revise or introduce new typologies to manage really new payment systems that are coming up.
Thanks, Roy. And just to continue this specific topic, right? We are talking about patterns, scenarios, and as I said, right, there are a lot of definitions of how these sort of scenarios and patterns can be actually shared, right? And that's the first theme of our topic. Onto that, I would love to move to Catherine, right? And would love to hear any specific examples in this area from Catherine, and specifically on specific gaps that you believe that the current systems currently have. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Abhishek. Well, first, there's a wide disparity in the systems that are used by different banks. You have banks that, more sophisticated ones, that are using some degree of robotics, and it may have a case management system. And then you've got other banks that are still working these things on spreadsheets and have a sneaker brigade, as we sometimes call it, who on each case that they get are toggling between screens and taking screenshots and making notes in spreadsheets that are only on their computer. So let's take the case. We have at one bank a Norwegian national who suddenly, having never had any record of being out of the country before, he's withdrawing huge sums of cash on a nightly basis for 5 nights at a hotel and casino in Las Vegas. Now, you and I might look at that at the very beginning and say, oh, somebody who went to a conference, probably gambling, and is going to go home. Somebody who is doing AML monitoring without the aid of robotics may spend 4 or more hours sitting there doing research to determine what is happening here, since it's completely outside the expected parameters and the profile that the bank has on file. And they will ultimately reach the same conclusion that we reached looking at it, or that might be reached if there are robotics involved and AI is able to be applied so that you can cut out a lot of that legwork. Then when we think about the same situation post-COVID, you and I might know that the casinos were closed. This puts an entirely different spin on it, but still, it is not going to match up with the profile. And then when we think about patterns and the power of having this aggregated, if you were able to see that, well, 55 people from Norway went and engaged in this same pattern during the time when casinos were closed, you would get a completely different take on that. And it's the power of having a pattern system that can aggregate versus having individual banks to individual circumstances is really something that can move us forward a great deal as we try to figure out what is happening in a very dramatically changed environment, which we have now with COVID. Supply chains have been disrupted, ways of transacting have been disrupted. As Roy said, people are using more Venmo. We need to move much, much more quickly, and we need to be able to see in the aggregate what these activities mean.
These are some great insights, specifically on the definition of patterns, right? Because what we are clearly saying that the definition of pattern, which is an aggregated activity behavior, is one of the more effective ways to share such information. John, I would love to move to you, right, and would like to get your definition of the AML patterns that we talk about. Would love to know, like, do you really agree to that definition of the aggregated behavior could be a way to represent that? And more importantly, would also like to know what do you think are the key aspects to consider to share these patterns across the financial institutions?
Thank you, Abhishek. Yes, I certainly agree that you're going to get more optimal results when you can, in different ways, look to aggregate categories of data, not just look at individual customers or transaction-related data. I think if we look at this broader concept of patterns, there's actually 4 different categories of indicators on which banks and other financial institutions could draw to develop these kinds of aggregated patterns and look for situations that, as Catherine was just talking about, help AML compliance people to move more quickly to identify genuinely problematic transactions and relationships and eliminate the ones that really aren't a cause for concern. I mean, certainly one thing to focus on immediately are indicators that relate to the transaction itself. Compared to the typical activity that institutions might see in a particular city or particular region, the mere size of the transactions, the type of the transactions, the frequency of the transactions themselves may be sufficiently atypical and anomalous that those are part of the overall pattern of aggregation of data that you'd want to be looking at. But of course, you want to be looking at customer data as well. Like, who are these purported individuals or businesses who are engaging in these transactions? And there too, there may be significant disparities between the type of activity that you see, and without getting into actual sharing of personally identifiable information, looking at data that relates to the customers in terms of their age, their employment, their general status. For example, if you saw a group of accounts that supposedly have been set up by people who are college students, but you saw large amounts of cash or other transactions moving through them, that in itself is a significant indicator that something's not right, that's not according with what's logical and expected as those types of transactions. You also have to look at who the counterparties are in these kinds of transactions, because certainly it's important for the financial institution to know where is this money going, who supposedly is otherwise involved in this transaction. And then finally, network indicators themselves. There may be indicators about, in addition to all these other categories of aggregated data, that help the institution to determine that these relationships, these activities have to do with certain network-related activity that themselves can be indicators or real red flags that are problematic. So if you look at all four of those categories and think about ways of aggregating data for not just individuals, but for groups of activity during the same periods of time, and with these four categories of indicators, those can be very powerful in helping to move more quickly to identifying those genuinely problematic transactions and customer relationships, and to weed out the ones that really aren't a basis for regulatory or law enforcement concern.
These are great points that you had brought forward, right? And I just would, love to get Roy's thoughts on that, primarily from a practitioner point of view. And Roy, in this specific aspect, right, would love to get any real examples that you might have in mind, which can kind of give this sort of the definition a more realistic feeling. And number two, right, would love to know from in your points, right, what would be the key drivers that can encourage banks to introduce new patterns in their transaction monitoring systems? Roy, I think you're on mute.
My apologies, I'm not following the rules here. So I think, Abhishek, to your question, right, John put it very nicely. Lots of good examples over there. But what I will add over here is, if you create a library of patterns or scenarios or typologies, right, it drives a lot of efficiency, right? I do not have to start from scratch because you have developed those, you found them to be effective, and they can be utilized, and just speed to market, right? It allows you to get those into your environment quickly. Examples of these might be for me, right? If you have activity that looks at, or if you have a pattern that looks at mule activity or funnel activity, right? Those follow a very typical pattern. You have many depositors, right, making individual deposits at many locations, and then you have the money coming out of a completely different location, right? So you have that type of a profile and that type of a scenario at play. So those can be very helpful. If you look at cash-intensive businesses, you would expect to see certain behavior patterns. Anything that's an anomaly to that, right, you should be able to detect some type of potentially suspicious pattern in there that would prompt you, to move further with an investigation. So I think a lot of those things are quite useful in terms of creating a library and allowing banks to have access to it. I think the caution over here is always, right, what information are you sharing, right? You cannot share personal, identifiable information. We've said that, I think, a few times already this morning, right? Keeping any of that customer information out, right? Keeping account information out, but really detecting patterns and putting those in the library, I think, can be quite useful. The other point I'll make over here, right? It is about patterns for banks that operate in a similar geography or have similar profiles, right? If you were a regional bank that didn't have a whole lot of foreign customers and foreign activity, right? I'm not so sure you'd be interested in sharing that information with big banks, right? That for them it's quite useful, but for me, the return on sharing that information is quite minimal. So I think understanding who you're sharing it with and how that's going to benefit you in terms of making your transaction monitoring environment more effective, I think is probably more critical there.
Got it. And I think this, you rightly talked about, sharing information. You rightly talked about, privacy concerns. This is where I would love to move to Robert, right? And just wanted to discuss, right, his thoughts on the current 314B system, right, which allows sharing of information. Would want to hear, how effective is the current program? How can, what are the things that we can learn from the program in our pattern sharing approach, which can make it truly more effective? Over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Abhishek. So when we say 314B, just to refresh, it's Section 314B from the USA Patriot Act. Section 314A was a section which FinCEN every couple of weeks will send financial institutions lists of names to which financial institutions are obligated to review their transaction information, their customer information, to see if they have a match and then respond. 314B is a little different. 314B is volunteer. You have the ability to register with FinCEN to share your information with another financial institution or vice versa to determine AML and CFT to better determine AML and CFT investigations. It's actually a very good tool. I have been a registered 314B at 4 financial institutions. If you follow the rules, if you play with what you're given, you can do a lot. You can not only get better additional information on your customer or on the transaction activity of your customer, but you also aid the financial institutions to which you're interfacing to better understand their customer and transaction activity. They might not even be aware of potential activity. There might be something that's alerting on your side that they're not seeing on their side. It also can aid in making a decision to say, now that I have this additional information, I don't find this to be potentially suspicious, and you can close this out because you have better clarity there. And at the end of the day, you're going to be able to say if it's in fact something that is suspicious, you'll have more robust information to include in the SAR, which will benefit FinCEN. The challenge that I found is that financial institutions weren't always comfortable providing the information. Now, there is a safe harbor. 314B offers you the safe harbor, but sometimes they will just give you limited information. Sometimes they'll provide you with that limited information, message that they'll be following up with you, and they won't. I think you're recognizing that the purpose of this is solely for AML CFT. I think some financial institutions have concerns about the tool in that it might be used to, okay, now that I've given you the other side of the transaction, now that I have this high net worth customer, maybe you're going to come in and try to bring them into your shop. So I think that recognizing that that's a potential risk, that's not what it's supposed to be used for, but I think that could lead to why some banks are hesitant to use the tool. I think going forward, I think it can be a valuable tool. I think in terms of if banks now are using patterns to review activity, I think it would even bring it to another level. But it depends on how comfortable banks are and financial institutions are and what their appetite is for using 314B.
Thanks, Robert, and I think thanks, Roy, John, and Catherine for such interesting discussion on this theme. Just wanted to sum it up, the first part of the discussion. We all are kind of in agreement that the current TM systems are fragmented. It definitely generates a lot of false positives, might not be fully effective in the current situation where scenarios are changing, where the data is changing, where the customer behavior is changing, and we need to move on to a more integrated approach. So one of the approaches that we discussed is about AML pattern sharing. We talked about the definition of pattern sharing because that's a key aspect here. The definition here that we talked about is, it's an aggregated behavior and activity which leads to a suspicious situation, which can be packaged in form of 4 components, which we talked about: customer, counterparty, network, and customer, which provides us a way or a protocol in which the suspicious situation can be shared seamlessly. This pattern essentially can help us break a complex money laundering situation, and on the screen we have an example into these sort of relevant indicators, which we call as basic building blocks in a very secure environment. To the audience, there is a poll coming up. Would appreciate your participation. I would move on to our next theme. The next theme essentially is Tukitaki is proposing a transaction monitoring utility as a mechanism to share these money laundering patterns across financial institutions in a easy, privacy preserved way. The utility can use Tukitaki's topology repository and its capabilities to seamlessly update and share patterns across FIs. In this way, we would enable a collective intelligence while improving returns and process of that efficiency. On that context, I would like to understand what a panelist thinks. More importantly, the key consideration for creating such utility service. So to begin this second theme, I would start with John, right, to really understand from his experience as part of the regulatory environment, what would be the key considerations that somebody need to think about when creating the utility service using a library of patterns that we just discussed about. So John, over to you. John, I think you are on mute.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of key considerations that we need to keep in mind in talking about how financial institutions could be more effective in making use of these kinds of patterns. First of all, I think we have to be thinking in terms of a dynamic system. That is, this isn't just looking at aggregations of patterns, customer relationships, counterparties, network indicators on any given day. Money laundering organizations are dynamic themselves. They are always looking to probe for new ways in which they can effectively move large amounts of money. And financial institutions themselves, even in making use of the kinds of patterns we're talking about, have to be thinking about developing typologies that are not only effective in identifying what's happening, let's say, this day, this week, or this month, but what happens over time. In other words, AML patterns aren't static at all times for all regions of a given country. You have to be thinking about changes that may occur if, for example, law enforcement moves in and has some very highly publicized arrests and search warrants and so on relating to particular money laundering operations. Financial institutions themselves need to be similarly flexible so that what they can do, in effect, through these kinds of typologies is take advantage of recognizing that patterns will change over time, and having that flexibility to aggregate information over time is critical in this area. I think the other thing I would say is that because this is a heavily regulated environment, regulators are going to want to know when they come in for bank examinations, or you have external audits or other situations where you have to justify the soundness, the effectiveness of your AML compliance program, having this kind of approach, showing this kind of dynamic approach, I think can actually be beneficial for financial institutions when they can say, we're not relying on traditional rules-based approaches here. We are doing this in a way that is more dynamic, that is sensitive to changing circumstances and conditions, and benefits everyone by having a broader range of information that we are sharing among ourselves. So it's not just our bank's experience, it's the collective experience of multiple institutions whose information on customers, on transactions, on network-related indicators, on counterparties makes everyone who participates in this kind of approach that much more effective and efficient in running their AML compliance efforts.
Got it. And these are very interesting points that, John, you had brought about, that the dynamic nature of the system, which kind of keeps on evolving and continuously growing, is key, right? And on that very specific note, right, I would love to know from Catherine, right, any additional points that you think that we should consider as we think about building this as a utility service.
Well, I think one of the important points, and I'll build on everything Jonathan said, with which I agree fully, the ability to move quickly and the ability to recognize patterns and trends that are happening anywhere in the world very quickly without having to have the input of a large staff of employees looking at these issues is something that is really critical and that really can't be replaced in any other way. And when we think about the current circumstances that we're laboring under, where many folks who do AML monitoring are now working from home, these systems have been disrupted. Building a federated learning atmosphere where we can, in an automated way, collect these patterns and identify them and feed back that information allows us to remain active in this battle against money laundering, no matter what the prevailing circumstances are. So, I think to me, speed is a really a separating factor that makes this much more attractive than doing it individually. And the other thing is, many people these days, very few have a relationship with only one bank or one issuer. And so the power of aggregating also, I think, will enable us to create profiles for people within individual banks that are much more fulsome. And we won't be as reliant on having individual, very manually intensive profile updates that occur, at most once a year in most banks. This real-time speed component is something that I think will move us forward tremendously.
Got it. Robert, you want to add anything here?
Robert, you're on mute.
So Robert, you are on mute.
I'm sorry, I didn't know if you noticed. I had to step away for a second, so I didn't hear the end of Catherine's comments. I'm sorry.
No problem. So what we were discussing was, as we build out this utility service, right? What would be key considerations that needs to be considered in terms of the patterns, in terms of how we're evolving, that makes it a very effective program.
Okay, thank you. And again, I'm sorry. I don't know if this was brought up, because I know it's something that we discussed yesterday when we were speaking, and that is the port of entry for users. If we're talking about shared information on patterns, if we have those users who might not have as robust information, it won't be as effective. So you might have some folks, some financial institutions that are users of it, but maybe not providers and not aiding it. So I don't know if this is open acceptance for everybody, but I think there needs to be some level of vetting. So you're not looking at a garbage in, garbage out where you have some problematic information which is causing problems.
Got it. Thank you, John, Robert, and Catherine, for your views. My next question is to Roy, right? The question is that, on data availability. And my specific question is that, can availability of data be challenged to implement the AML pattern sharing through this utility service that we are talking about?
Yeah, Abhishek, I think, data is never going to be perfect, right? So we have, no different than any other bank. Data is fragmented, I would say, in different places. I think being able to supplement data with not only what you have internally, but externally, right, absolutely enhances, your view of and paints a more holistic picture. Maybe that's the best way to say that. It allows you to understand what's truly happening. As an example, if you have a customer that makes deposits at your institution and then wires money to another institution, right? If you had a view into what that activity at the other institution might look like, it may paint a picture for you that says, okay, that makes a lot of sense, right? And this is clearly not suspicious activity, right? But if you don't have that, and you don't have that aggregated information, you don't have sharing of patterns of activity in that sense, right? You probably are most likely going to say, I don't quite understand what the customer is doing, I'm going to file a SAR on that, right? And probably that's not very useful for law enforcement. So I think, right, data never going to be perfect, but I think supplementing it from a lot of, good data available in external sources, right, as well as leveraging what you have internally, plus through a federated approach, if you can, come up with the magic over here, right, of getting the right patterns, the right type of sharing, and the right forum to do that, I think you end up in a good place.
Got it. Thanks, Roy. I think the last topic in this theme, which is one of the key components of the utility service, is privacy and data security, right? And that is something that, Roy, you also touched upon. I think I will open it up to Robert to begin, right? Would love to know your thoughts on how do you think, or what are the key things that we need to think through to ensure privacy of these sort of patterns are protected in the best possible manner, so that financial institutions can get the comfort to be part of this sort of a collective intelligence effort that would allow the TM ecosystem to dramatically evolve over time. So, Robert, over to you.
Sure. So thank you. We do recognize that there are some jurisdictions that have restrictions, so the information is totally unavailable. So when it comes to potentially personally identifiable information, you cannot touch it. It's in the European Union. It's a fundamental right in the European Union. There are other countries, China, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Slovakia, Czech Republic, many out there of which the information is not available. In other countries, such as the U.S., it's sectoral, where the USA Patriot Act through 326B provides all customers, potential customers, notice that personally identifiable information is going to be requested, and it must be provided. So in terms of where you can get data, where you can't get data, a lot of it's going to be depending upon jurisdiction. I think too, when we talk about and think about the use of pattern, going back to the Norwegian example, that was a very macro pattern, and that would work very well. In the sharing of pattern activity, we say a Norwegian citizen. If we were to say a Norwegian diplomat or a UN representative, it's a little more specific. You'll be able potentially to figure out who that person is. So when we are creating pattern, when we are reviewing pattern of activity, even though it is at a macro level, at a pattern without it being identifiable, that we must be careful not to provide too much information so that it can be determined who that potential person or entity is.
Great points that you mentioned, right? Number one, on one side, we need to be cognizant of the location-specific privacy concerns. On the other side, we need to be very specific that we are able to aggregate those information so that there is no such concerns on data privacy. But the other thing that I think you also had mentioned before, right? How do we make sure that the patterns are not garbage as well, so that it's effective for the banks to be shared as well? Jonathan, right? Would love to hear your thoughts from a regulator perspective, right? What would be the key considerations in building such utility service, specifically from privacy and data security point of view?
Sure. On the data security point, I think as with any data sharing situation, Robert talked about 314B opportunities earlier, or any other situation where you have sharing in some fashion, the same day-to-day concerns that every financial institution has to have with regard to data security don't go away just because you are now collaborating in this kind of a more federated environment. That is, you still have to be thinking about how you individually as a financial institution have to maintain your cybersecurity efforts across the board, even as you are a participant in this larger frame of reference. And that has to be a mutual understanding that everyone who is a participant in this basically is agreeing that they too will be keeping up to absolutely current standards in maintaining data security, deal with potential cyber risks, and so on. As to data privacy, I think Robert's point is well taken with regard to the legal limitations that various jurisdictions do place. So I think one way to think about this is to say, that's fine. We will not share information that is violative of any supervening legal restrictions like the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. But let's share what we do have. There may be other kinds of patterns that are not reflective of individual personal data that can still be brought into this larger set of typologies, this larger set of AML-related patterns that can be useful. So in a way, you could be thinking of this as a take what you can get, make the best use of what you have, even in those, if you have the opportunity to tap into some information from institutions in those jurisdictions that are governed by more significant data privacy restrictions, and still continue to build out and make more robust these kinds of dynamic approaches to building and maintaining and modifying AML patterns that can be useful to the larger cluster of institutions who are participants in this process.
Got it. So just to sum up, right? A lot of the things that you mentioned, right, as concluding thoughts in this utility service, right? There are a couple of points that I just want to kind of bring together based on today's discussion, right? So on one side, we all agree that some sort of federated machine learning techniques can really help develop a comprehensive TAM program. But we also agree, as you said, right, the ever-evolving space, the AML systems needs to be smart enough to handle these sort of ever-growing situations in a way which allows to quickly learn from a collective intelligence, not just looking at siloed data sets, which would finally end up helping our false alerts reduction, which would help us detect new cases, and overall makes this sort of a TM system more powerful than what it is today. But there are certain realities that we need to look into, and we talked about the privacy and data security concerns. We talked about data would always be a problem, but we have to work with that and kind of create that ecosystem. More importantly, we also talked about being able to create a participation and collaboration ecosystem among FIs, regulators, third-party vendors to really make this successful. So I thought that this sort of concludes the second theme of the discussion, and thank you, panelists, for this. What we would do now, we would have a quick poll. I would really request audience to look forward to the poll and take part so that we can make these sessions more enriching. We have received some very interesting questions from the audience, and thanks for being so interactive. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to start opening up the questions, and I know that we would have time for maybe 2 or maximum 3 of these questions. The first question that we have received is specifically on the utility service. So the question that I hear is that we all talked about the benefits of the AI-based federated learning system, right? Which can really help improve the current siloed-based processes that is have. But the question says that why don't we see banks adopting such pattern-based approach on a much more massive scale than what we are today? As a practitioner, Roy, would you want to pick that up?
Sure. I think I may have, Abhishek alluded to that earlier, right? I think you're going to continue to have a reluctance, right, just to share information because of several reasons, right? One is, data security is a big issue, right? Understanding how data is going to get protected and how data is going to get used, I think is a really important consideration that never goes away, right? Given the cyber environment we're in. That's an important piece. I think the second piece is, who am I sharing it with, right? If it's banks that operate within sort of my general geography, then there is a benefit to sharing that information. I think Catherine may have pointed this out. Customers have accounts with other institutions also, right? So typically they'll have accounts with other financial institutions that are within your geography. It's very unlikely that they would have accounts with an institution that is not in your geography, right? So I think understanding what the true benefit of sharing that information, right, is always going to be a challenge and a hurdle. I think the last but not least is, right, what does that sharing actually mean to you, right? Is it going to drive effectiveness in your program? Is it going to drive efficiency in your program, right? Those require a fair amount of analysis so that you can actually quantify what that is, right? So I think when you get through those hurdles, I think then it becomes easier to see that, federated approach of sharing, whatever that sharing entails, right, is beneficial.
Got it. And Roy, the next question, which kind of directly segues into what you said, the question says, how can pattern sharing help us prioritize alert and gain efficiency? Which I think right up the question that you mentioned, right? Do you want to pick that up?
I'm sorry, Abhishek, I lost you. You cut off over there.
No, the question kind of segues into the what you were saying. The question says, how can AML pattern sharing help us bring in efficiency and prioritize our alerts better?
Yeah, so the first part of that is, how does it create efficiency? So if you do your risk assessment and you do that well, right, you identify clearly inherent risks in your program, right? Whether that's as a result of the customers you have, products and services you offer, geography or transactions, right? If you identify, as the earlier example, that you are most susceptible to, funnel activity, mule activity, right? You would want to leverage, if you will, a library that might have those type of scenarios already built and understood, right, from an effectiveness standpoint. So you're not starting from ground zero, right? And if you can leverage that and can use those as a starting point, I think you create clearly efficiency in terms of, your time to market, to getting that into your program, right? It may not be perfect, but you will have clearly the makings of what someone already has put out there as being quite effective in identifying potential suspicious activity as it relates to that particular pattern, right?
I think another that question might be, Abhishek, the acceptance that the regulators would have to such products. I think that this is brand new, and why aren't we seeing more financial institutions utilizing such tools? Because people are kind of, crawling before they're walking here. They're seeing who's doing things. My understanding when I speak to people that are with financial institutions is, and they are looking to implement such measures, they're working directly with the regulators. They're keeping the regulators in the sandbox, so to speak. You don't want to surprise the regulators in any way. This is a new concept. You want to have that regulator blessing, and then when other financial institutions, they'll follow suit. But until it becomes more popular and more known, we're going to be where we are right now.
And on the question of how will it help prioritize alerts too, I think you've got to keep in mind, we're talking now about something that is going to use artificial intelligence and federated learning in a way that will enable the understanding of the risks inherent in these patterns to be much, much greater than when we have just a single bank, single human beings looking at it, or even some less sophisticated form of AI.
Got it. And just to add on to that question, the next question which we got is that should banks wait for a clearer policy from regulators before adopting AI-powered platforms, which is, I think, what Robert had just mentioned. So, John, would you want to take that up?
Sure. I think one starting point, which actually ties in with the comments that you just heard from Roy, Robert, and Catherine, is that U.S. bank regulators have previously issued joint guidance which says we encourage financial institutions to do more to innovate technologically and collaborate in new and better solutions. So this kind of situation is actually a perfect one for multiple institutions to say, you said we should be experimenting in this area. That is what we are doing. We are exploring the use of AI. We're exploring the use of federated learning. We're exploring the use of finding ways of aggregating patterns of activity so that we all benefit. I think that actually should have some genuine appeal for bank regulators, regardless of what category of institution you might be in the United States, for example. And I think you see similar indications from regulators in other parts of the world. I think regulators have come to recognize that they can't just keep treating individual institutions as though they must solve all the problems of compliance by themselves without help, without collaboration. That in fact is, as Robert indicated earlier, what 314B is about. So I think it is actually a very positive thing for any financial institution to be able to say to their regulators or their auditors, we're doing this not just because we think this makes good business sense, we're doing this in part because you, regulators, have said we should be doing this, and that's what we're trying to do. And that actually can be a very good talking point with the proviso that you say, we don't have guarantees that this will work perfectly or always to your satisfaction. But if we don't try, we never make progress. If we don't experiment with new approaches, then we're back at the same old place with the same old kinds of problems that others have talked about in this session of too many false positives, too much time wasted. So I think it actually can be a very strong selling point in talking to regulators to say, we are trying this because this seems to make sense. There's a use case for us in trying this approach.
Onto this, right, Roy, Catherine, do you want to add any points here from a regulatory point?
I would just add, I'd echo what John said over here. I think there is great encouragement to go down this path, right, as a result of the joint guidance that was put out. I think keeping the regulators, right, in the loop is critical, right, and each of the regulatory agencies, I believe, have already set up offices of innovation, right, that allow you to showcase, right, what you're trying to accomplish over here. So that partnership and that collaboration, I think, is just so critical. And I think it's really important. You don't want to work, with this stuff in a vacuum, right? You're trying to get to a better place and transform, in many ways, what the current environment is. And there is so much opportunity with new technology, right? Whether that's machine learning, whether that's AI, to get to that better place. And I think through in working with regulators and working with the Office of Innovation over here and collaboratively coming up with those solutions, I think you clearly have an opportunity to get to a better place.
Thank you, Roy and John and Robert. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm just going through that list. The question that I'm getting here is that Given the general environment where the banks may be more concerned about optimizing their investment budgets, how would one justify making an investment in a new capability like this one? I just open it up to the panel to take this one.
I think you need to take a long-term view on this, and clearly, I think when one looks at this, the efficiencies that can be gained by not having people doing manual work and trying to figure out patterns within an individual bank versus having a federated learning capability where you benefit from the resources of all banks participating, to me, is one that individual banks will, of course, do their own studies with regard to their budgeting, but it really does seem to promise being able to do this on a much more cost-effective basis. And to go back to some of the comments on false positives before, I think we need to keep in mind that so much of the work that is being done with the current transaction monitoring systems comes to naught. And so if you look at the economics, I think there's a lot to be said in favor of moving to this environment from an economic efficiency perspective.
Got it. Roy, any thoughts from you? Robert, John, any thoughts on this one?
I mean, I think Catherine is absolutely right. You constantly want to transform your program, right? You constantly want to innovate, and it's not all about efficiency.
It's not all about
Right?
efficiency.
It's very much about effectiveness in the program.
Very much about effectiveness in the program.
If you end up, taking out waste, right, as it simply relates to false positives. If you have fewer false positives, you're taking out that waste. You have the ability to deploy those resources, to better outcomes someplace else, right? To work on more important things for law enforcement. So I see it that way, right? It's not about always efficiency. It's both. It's efficiency and effectiveness in the program.
And there's progression. It's showing that financial institutions are taking initiatives, and we've gone from spreadsheets, we've gone from automation, we've gone to rules, and we're moving from Flintstonian to Jetsonian. We're making steps that are positive steps, and some of them are unknown right now, but we're ready for it, and hopefully the regulators are ready for the challenge with us.
I think, thank you all. Thank you, Roy, Robert, Catherine, Jonathan. This has been a great panel, and we had such an interesting discussion. Introduction of the patent sharing is definitely a kind of a new concept, and this discussion was really enriching, I think, not only for us, but also for the audience. So on behalf of Tukitaki, I would love to thank the panelists as well as the audience for their participation. We have got some large amount of questions. Probably what we would do is once this is over, we'll collect them and reach out to you all to find answers and send it back to your audiences, because the amount of response that we are seeing here is amazing. So what we'd also do is that all of our audience will send some key learnings from today's roundtable as a small token of appreciation from Tukitaki. Just do watch your emails. We really look forward to conducting similar thought-provoking and innovative sessions, specifically in the area of federated learning and patent sharing, because the participation has been amazing for this roundtable. We would like to conclude here. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Once again, goodbye and have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Thank you.